Hello and welcome to the Unusual Stories podcast. My name is Wojciech Salski. I'll be your host for today. And before we start, may I remind you as per usual, if you find this podcast useful, if you think it's entertaining, interesting, it helped you read a book for once, then please do feel free to support. The best way to support would obviously be click the follow button and share it with a friend. That's by far the most efficient way. Alternatively, you can always support me by just sending a nice email letting me know that I'm doing a good job. And of course, if you'd like to support the podcast financially, then please follow the link below. And I'm very grateful for all the support I'm being offered on the daily basis. And so that just warms my heart. And thank you so much. And finally, really, thank you for listening. And I hope this episode is once again something that you've been looking for. So, without further ado, I have for you, as I promised, yet again, a book by David Hawkins. This time round, we're going to dive a little bit deeper. So, for context, if you remember, I think 2 years ago was the time when the Letting Go book aired as my episode, which very quickly became the most popular, or I think right now second most popular, right after the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying episode on this podcast. And I'm not surprised. As I mentioned earlier, I do believe that there are ideas, books, people that have higher frequency, a higher power, and therefore they are, resonating with more people and they are more resonant with the world. And for example, I do believe that all the sacred books, such as the Bible, Quran, or Torah, all of them are innately as well a very powerful, in themselves, medium of information and sort of being translated throughout the world. And therefore, I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, I did in the future an episode on a book such as the Bible, which would obviously be a very unlikely to be a fulfilling kind of an experience, I think. Similarly to Quran or Torah, or any other of those sacred books, I think, obviously I could only do as much as my limited self can, but I wouldn't be surprised if those would be the most popular episodes going forward. It does make sense, simply. And it is in line with what David Hawkins suggests to us in his book Letting Go and in his other writings. So 2 years ago, the Letting Go came out in terms of my book review for you, and you loved it. So I thought after some time that maybe it's time to pick it up a bit again. And so I've chosen a few of the books of David Hawkins as well that I think are relevant to what we've been discussing. And I brought them here for you. So last week, we've had a chance to look at Power versus Force, which, as I mentioned, seems to me a good starting point if you're a bit more practically focused person. So personally, I started with the Letting Go, and I did read Letting Go the most amount of times, I think 3 or 4 by now. And I would still say start with the Letting Go, but I did find after reading Power versus Force that it might resonate more with people that are a bit more sort of practically oriented, or don't necessarily want to hear so much about faith, and they want to hear much more about sort of the interactions between people. So, for example, one of my friends, big shout out to Łukasz, who was on my podcast a while back. I gave him the Power versus Force book a few years ago as a gift. And I did feel that with him it's going to resonate more than the Letting Go, simply because it was a bit more practically focused. And there seemed to be more sort of discernment about the whole practice of letting go, rather than the stories and explanations behind it. Now, feel free to listen to the episode from previous week if you didn't. I'll put the link below as well for you. And I'll put the link below as well for the Letting Go episode. And now this week, I'd like to talk with you about a book that dives much deeper. It's called Transcending the Levels of Consciousness, and the subtitle is The Stairway to Enlightenment. And it's quite a title, I would say, to begin with. So as you can imagine, if you've not resonated much and you truly read either of the books I mentioned, this book is probably not for you. I found it exhilarating. I flew through it. And quite frankly, all of the works of David Hawkins I found very, very impactful. And therefore I'm sharing them with you, and I do believe they are one of the few that really made a great impact on me, similarly to works of Jordan Peterson, just in a different sphere, let's say. But this one is definitely suitable if you liked what you've explored in either Letting Go or Power versus Force, and you'd like to dive a bit deeper. So my first point here for you is that basically, I guess it's this sort of approach. I would encourage you to explore this book for yourself, in the spirit of going all the way. So if you found that whatever you've encountered for yourself, because I'm pretty sure you've picked up other things in the previous books we've mentioned than myself, I think everyone does, then if you found something there worth your time and it seems to resonate with you, then go all the way and dive into this one, which is much more detailed on the side of sort of drilling much more comprehensively into the ideas shared and the map of consciousness that we've talked about, and I'll pop it on the screen in a moment, and the different levels of consciousness that we've discussed last week. All of these in Transcending the Levels of Consciousness are elaborated upon to the degree that is, I could say, academic, maybe that's a good way to put it. Very, very detailed, very deep. And the interesting thing about it, and maybe that's my invitation to you, is I do believe a big part of enjoying the journey through this book in particular is if you sort of give yourself over to this text, as you put your ego on pause, you approach it with a high level of humility, and you approach it with a level of a sort of openness and an open heart, accepting that what you will find there might not necessarily be what you like, because the descriptions that are given and the guidelines that are provided, at least for me, especially in those few areas that I find myself struggling with. So, as we mentioned earlier last week, I do believe that there are moments in my life when I'm in trouble of dwelling too much in the area of anger or in the area of pride. And so those chapters in particular and the guidelines provided within them and the descriptions given were very difficult for me to deal with. And it was just a challenging read, because in many ways I had to experience firsthand my ego's opposition to what is offered. And I think that's going to be a case for anyone out there who tries to engage with these and any other powerful and spiritually sort of charged book. I think the biggest challenges we face in terms of overcoming some of our weaknesses is to first note that these weaknesses do exist and be happy and frank. Happy is a wrong word. Be open and frank about them to yourself, and especially to your ego, with your ego, which is definitely sort of nibbling away at your ability to achieve higher level of consciousness, as we've discussed. So a quote that really stayed with me from Bukowski, from his story, that I recalled as I was preparing the episode for you, is this quote: don't try to do something. Either do it or don't, but don't try. And the way I understand this particular sort of invitation, or maybe discouragement in many ways, is do not do something half-heartedly. If you want to explore Transcending Levels of Consciousness as a book, then give yourself the time and the space and the courage to do so with full awareness and with full humility, because you will need it. And I wrote down here this phrase yet again that it seems to perpetuate quite a few of our recent episodes, is if you want to take the island, burn the boats. Go all the way. Really put yourself in a position of power by becoming courageous to face your weaknesses. And transcending the levels of consciousness, it is a stairway to enlightenment in a way that, at least, even though you might not be able to walk up that stairway straight away, it does chart the map for you to do so. And if you remember, we've mentioned it last week, according to David Hawkins, it is not actually that... it's highly unlikely for an individual in one life to achieve greater than, I think, 5 or 10 points growth on that scale. So be humble and courageous enough to admit to yourself that, you know, it's not going to be a walk in the park, and it's not like you're going to pick up the book, read it, and suddenly you're enlightened. You're highly unlikely to have that experience. According to Hawkins, just a few individuals over the span of millennia are enough aligned, suitably aligned with their karma, which he recalls, and I will talk about karma in a second, and with their sort of spiritual energy, that they can achieve those higher levels. But that doesn't mean we should not strive towards that. You know, it's like this idea of pointing at a star, wishing upon a star, and working towards it. You can have goals and dreams that might not be within your reach, because just by attempting and making yourself better to be more likely to achieve them, you are gaining ground in this sort of struggle for your progress. And similarly, in the spirit of spiritual progression, I think it is not unuseful to strive and to know what you're striving for, while acknowledging that, you know, maybe not in this life, maybe not in this year, maybe not in this decade, will you be able to fully immerse yourself in that state that you're striving for. You know, it's a great idea and approach to be and to sort of model yourself upon people and ideas that you find deeply meaningful. So, you know, a good example here is like, tell the truth or at least don't lie, right? Obviously, even though I might be living with this as my guiding principle every day, I will falter and I will fail to deliver from time to time. It's a human, we are imperfect, right? And in our struggle through this darkness of ignorance and difficulties that life throws at us, we are likely to stumble and fall from time to time. And so, you know, I think this is where humility really plays a big part of this all, because you need to have the courage to try, but you have to have the humility to recognize that you might fail, and you should not become self-loathing, and you know, you should not diminish yourself because you failed. It's a normal thing. It's a human experience. And so, you know, the stairway to enlightenment that Hawkins offers us in his works, and that many spiritual books give us guidance on, does not it does not mean that this is the only way, and it does not mean that you will just sort of snap your fingers and wake up enlightened. It is highly unlikely. Nevertheless, though, as Bukowski invites us to go all the way, to not try but just do it, I think it is fair to say, if you're interested in this and if you feel it is empowering for you, like it is for myself, then why wouldn't you try? Why wouldn't you do all you can to become all you can be? And I think this is the main point of all the self-development in any area of life. You know, the idea, you know, is a very simple one, and I think very relatable to anyone out there who ever enjoyed a sport of any kind or any discipline of any kind. It is said, in terms of, for example, going to the gym, that you should put yourself in a position of failing probably like 20-30% of the time you're there. And this is not because, you know, it's great to fail. It's because in that narrow area between what you can do now and what you could do in a few weeks, months, years, lies the area of optimal growth, right? And it is the same with any other thing you might be doing. If you're learning a language and you've mastered the level A1, let's say, or A2, you need to put yourself in a position, whether through much more difficult exercises or through maybe some conversations you will have to have with people, to be able to advance onto that next level. Similarly, at school, we don't send children to school and straight away they go to the 6th grade, or they stay in the 1st grade for their whole school life. There is a natural progression that happens, and that progression is, to be efficient, it should be in this sort of optimal zone of proximal development. I think that's what they call it in terms of the scientific, more scientific language, more technical one. But that is the idea here. So similarly, I can strive to be that I wish to become, while allowing yourself this margin for error, and understanding and acknowledging that I will fail from time to time. And you know, this is sort of a tangent that I went on, but I think the practical use for us to consider as we read this book and as we explore works that empower us and inspire us is maybe just to give yourself this 30% leeway, right? So I've noticed I've shared with you earlier on the podcast that I have this little notebook that has like, spaces to mark if you've done your workout for the day or if you've done your studying, reading, writing for the day, whatever. And I did notice, and I'm pretty sure if I would put it through some big data analytics program, it would churn out a very similar response. It seems like I'm failing 20 or 30% of the time. So for example, if in a week I'm supposed to do 10 things on that list, I'm on a regular basis, I tend to do 7 out of 10. And I think this is from one of the lectures that Jordan Peterson said, that 70% beats the hell out of 0, and that always rings in my ear when I consider whether or not I did a good week or I did a good year. Is like, if you set yourself 5 or 10 goals for the year and you achieve half of them, or if you achieve 7 out of 10, think how amazing it is that you did achieve those. And think how useful it was, even though it might feel like, well, oh, what about those other 3 that I failed to do? Because we are prone to focus on the problems rather than what worked. Of course, it's a part of our survival instinct, the thing, and the risk aversion that we've discussed before. But the point here is, if you set yourself up to try and try again, you will increase your chances of succeeding, and you will become a better person through it. So it's not actually that you're working towards a goal because that goal itself is the most important of them all. Rather, by working towards a certain goal, you become the kind of person that is able to get there. So I think this is the biggest part about self-development, and similarly to transcending the levels of consciousness, you can strive to be the most loving, forgiving, and understanding person out there without comparing yourself to others, just with comparison to yourself. And even though sometimes you will falter in those, just by striving to do so, you will inevitably improve yourself in these areas. It's like practice, right? If you practice telling the truth all the time and you manage to get it 70% of the time, that beats the hell out of 0. And you have become, by default, a more truth-telling person if you would do so over a lengthy period of time. And so this is the idea of a humble and courageous progress towards a goal that you might not be able to achieve in the foreseeable future. It does pay off to try and strive for the most lofty of those goals. Sorry, that was a tangent out there. I hope that that did stir some of your emotions, and feel free to let me know if it did. Now, in terms of the book itself, I wanted to talk briefly about the detailing of guidelines inside it and the examples that David Hawkins offers us. And I think this is really useful in terms of, obviously we're taught again and again that we think in stories, we talk in stories. So when you meet someone on the street, if it's your friend or whatever, usually if they're gonna ask you like, how are you, what's up, you will tell them some sort of a story. You'll say, oh, I'm feeling a bit down today because yesterday this happened and I was there, and stuff like that. We tell things in stories, we learn in stories, and we enjoy stories as an entertainment. Ultimately, language developed and then was also developed into a written form on the basis of stories as the main point, right? So the idea was, first and foremost, we're trying to tell our fellow tribe members what happened and therefore they will learn and they will do something different, and so forth. So I'd like to talk about that. And just a second, I need to charge my laptop. Sorry for this, I'll be right back. And we're back. Okay, so in terms of the stories, as I said, since we are talking in stories, I think that's where David Hawkins really took advantage of this idea. And similarly to many other books that, are ultimately teaching us, inside Transcending the Levels of Consciousness, you will find plenty and plenty of stories and examples. Similarly to letting go and similarly to power versus force, there are areas where a lengthy description is given just to describe the state, or maybe the sort of the spiritual attributes of a certain level of consciousness. But for the most part, this book in particular goes very deep and detailed into guidelines by showing us examples of behaviors, situations, and activities and people that would allow us or will allow us to resonate with those areas, and also recognize in ourselves where the work might need to be done. And this is an interesting thing that I wanted to sort of discuss for a moment. It is said that people are like mirrors in terms of our activity. I don't remember from where I've heard this idea, but the point of it, for me at least, is that you get what you give in many ways. And as you do to others, it will be done upon you. I think that's one of the ideas as well that we can find in the Bible, for example. And in terms of this mirroring effect, I think it might be useful as you go through the motions, and maybe you'll get stuck on some of the problems that you encounter as you're, transcending your levels of consciousness, and you're becoming a more spiritually aligned and a joyful being, peaceful as well. It might be useful to recognize what kind of emotions and what kind of interactions you get from people and with people. For me, for example, I find again and again, I'm very ambitious in many ways. I always was, and not necessarily. I would not really sort of, especially when I was younger, I wouldn't go for competitions that were like really aggressive in ways. I'd much rather enjoy the competition which needed a bit more sort of social aptitude and the ability to work in a team. But I do find that because these areas of pride and anger, these levels of pride and anger, are the ones that I tend to fall down the pit of when I'm struggling with some things, and especially when I'm comparing myself to others, which does occur on a semi-regular basis when I'm struggling. It's usually when I'm down that my ego starts kicking me by, flashing an image of my very successful associate or someone I've known that I was jealous of. I found that, especially since I've been a bit more practicing and practically aware of how I feel about people and how people react to me, I allowed myself the space to understand what trouble I'm in myself. So just to make this point clear, for example, if I go to a party and let's say I meet an array of people, right? Of course, as per usual, wherever you're gonna go, whether it's a job or a party or a new encounter with a stranger, some people will naturally resonate with, and that usually, at least for me, signals that we have an aligned way of being, and maybe, you know, there is a certain attraction happening. And I think attraction is a word like that for a reason, because I do believe we attract what we sort of send out into the world. And we've discussed that last week, right? This whole idea of, if you are looking out in the world for trouble, you're probably going to get some trouble. If you're looking out into the world for love, you will find love. And you should probably be just quite specific about what kind of love you're looking for. But the example with the party, for example, is example of an example. I go to the party and I'll meet a group of new people, and there will be a few people that I feel naturally easygoing with. You know, these are my folks. Those are the people that I resonate with deeply, and the chat goes very well. It's easy, you know, sort of smooth sailing, and in many ways that's an indicator for me, as I said, that these are the kind of people I want to surround myself with, right? Obviously, it's natural for us to surround ourselves with our kin because it's more efficient, safe, and easy to do so, pleasurable as well. And then there usually is a person or two that I not necessarily resonate with. And it doesn't mean, I don't want to suggest here that like we're completely, you know, at odds with one another, but there are certain characters or certain maybe vibes that just don't click, right? And I find that on a regular basis, especially since, you know, recently I've had a chance to encounter a lot of new people in a new setting. I joined a big company, and especially during the first day when there was like, I think 300 people in a room, it was like a big ceremony, you know, everyone's joining, it's so great. And I get to talk with strangers in a very sort of semi-formal and very small talkish tone. I can very quickly feel whether or not we're clicking, you know, and sometimes, especially when you do have to, in some way, keep a conversation going, even though it's not going great, the struggle appears. And it's one thing, obviously, to take it upon yourself to become a better conversationist with that person and to be okay with them. The other thing that I want to talk about in terms of the mirroring is I try to practice this approach of first of all sort of relieving, letting go of the negativity that I might be feeling in that moment, but secondly of trying to figure out internally what might be the cause of my distress, because it takes two to tango, right? Of course, someone might be very awkward and you will just pick up on their awkwardness and you'll be awkward with them. The thing is though, it takes two, right? So if someone is awkward with you, but you're not awkward with them, and you don't allow their awkwardness to become your own, then that interaction is probably much easier to deal with than one that is an infection of awkwardness and maybe some sort of animosity. And this is my point, that you could, by allowing yourself the time on your own, at home, to read the books that we're discussing, to meditate or pray or whatever you call it, to contemplate the ideas that are given in those books. And then once you've sort of made peace with yourself on many levels and you observed what might be the trouble for you, and a good indicator is what will get stuck in your throat when you're reading the books and figuring out these things, like for example, if in the book there is a chapter on guilt and it really picks up your sort of ego's survival instinct of like, no, that's not right, that's not true, that's probably a good indicator that there is something out there, then you can go out into the world and practice it there. So as we've talked about before, this mindfulness practice of giving yourself the few seconds to react and choosing the reaction consciously. Similarly, if I have a certain interaction with another person and it doesn't resonate with me in a like good way, then I can feel that as an indicator there is something inside that I'm working through. And this is not to, to diminish yourself or to feel bad about it. It's an indicator. It's like, an information light that lights up on your car when something needs servicing or maybe something's not working correctly. It's an indicator that there has to be some inner work done. And ultimately, I think that could be considered one of those stairs on the stairway to enlightenment. And so this book in particular, Transcending the Levels of Consciousness, offers us guidelines and examples so we can then look at them and consider whether this is the kind of example and situation that you've been in. And there's plenty of them. More often than not, these are also very trivial, and one would consider they're trivial, and then you see them in that book discussing how to become more aligned in your spiritual path, and it turns out it's not so trivial after all, right? One more thing on this note that I wanted to touch is that a big part of this book is also David Hawkins' own experience or perception of his own experience, sort of tied into the book itself, and that was quite interesting and informative for me, that I found quite entertaining, really. And finally, before I go on to my third point for you of the day, I wanted to briefly touch on the idea of dark night of the soul. You might have heard it before. I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't. Although I don't know if you're certain whether or not you know what that means. I thought I did, and then turns out it's slightly different. So the dark night of the soul, as presented by David Hawkins, is the experience, the spiritual experience one may have when they fall from a higher level of consciousness to a lower state. So a good example might be it is quite sort of rapid and can be quite destructive for the ego and also for your own sort of sense of self, and is certainly something that should not be wished upon a person, although David Hawkins points it out as one of the necessary steps that your soul or whatever your consciousness has to go over and go through to be able to achieve enlightenment, which is an interesting thing. And I guess the point here is, I think it was Jung that said that one has to dig very deep into the roots of evil in oneself to understand what good is. And in this idea, I guess the idea of dark night experiencing the dark night of the soul lies within the space when knowing how it is to be up there and feeling great, you deal with something very troubling that brings you down into the depths of despair, which will allow you over time, if you overcome it in humility and courage, to later on be more strengthened and prepared for being up there once more. And I just found that concept and context to be quite interesting. So, as a sneak peek, I think this is, even if just this you're interested in, I think this is a book worth your time, let's say. Now, I want to touch briefly upon karma, because it's an interesting idea that I didn't fully, I think, resonate with when I read the book initially. I think over time, with reading a few other books, especially from different denominations and from different spiritual practices, I've grown more accustomed to it. If you remember, I named the cat that I've saved from the street in Kuwait, and then Karma now lives in Milan, and she's a proper Milanese cat now, a house cat. So she went quite up there, if you could consider it the levels of consciousness. She went from apathy of lying on the pavement and being close to dying to probably being quite high up there, jumping around in the Milanese flat of my co-worker's mom. But I'll read the quote here about karma as noted by David Hawkins, and then I'll chat a little bit about it. So the quote goes as such: "Karma is the consequence of decisions of the will and determines spiritual destiny after physical death. Positive karma can compensate for and undo negative karma. Spiritual progress occurs automatically from choosing goodwill, forgiveness, and lovingness as a way of being in the world." Now, let's unpack it, right? So, if you've been introduced to the idea of karma before, the way that I understand it from this and other practices and books and texts, it's the sort of an energy, baggage of energy, and maybe a spiritual energy that our soul, our consciousness, our Atman, whatever you want to call it in your denomination or in your philosophy, that we carry with ourselves. So if you do consider an idea that your spiritual being is not necessarily you, like me, Wojtek from Poland, that was born in 1997, rather there is a spiritual being inside of this meaty, funky-looking, thing that was given a name upon birth and stuff like that. If I believe that my spirit, my sort of soul, is separate from all that we can see and hear at the moment, then that spiritual being could potentially live through a few different human experiences. That there is a nice quote that says something like, "We are a spiritual being having a human experience rather than human beings having a spiritual experience." And so if we go down that rabbit hole of ideas, then it could be, and I do believe it to be true, that within my soul, since there have been quite a few stories and different meaty experiences the soul had, there has been some growth and potentially fluctuations similarly to the stock market or beating of one's heart, of these levels of consciousness being continued. And something resonant to this idea is the idea that we've already shared together in the most popular of the episodes, called the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche, which is basically a sacred text from the Tibet that states that there are bardo loops, and while we're going through life, there is a certain lesson that the soul has to go through. And this is, for example, me, Wojtek, today and over the course of hopefully next, let's say, 60 years, there is certain work that my soul is supposed to do. And so hopefully, if it is in alignment with the higher rather than lower, striving states, maybe the soul will be able to reincarnate itself in a better form, in a better life, in a better loop, in a better bardo later on. I don't want to dive too much into that. If you'd like to explore this idea in particular, please feel free to listen to the episode. I'll link it below as well. Or read the book. It's crazy, amazing. But it just resonates with me as an idea that this karma concept seems to be resonant to the bardo loops concept, and seems to be resonant to this idea in Christian faith, for example, that I have been brought up with, of falling down hell, right? So you're supposed to be a good Christian so you can go to heaven other than to hell. And it's a simplification, I would say, of the other thoughts. But if you do believe, and I do, that basically all faith, all religions, all philosophies are sort of a different branding of the same set of maybe universal truths, then it seems true to me to assume that, as David Hawkins says about ascending the levels of consciousness upwards on the stairway to enlightenment by acting out the good, by choosing goodwill, forgiveness, and lovingness as a way of being in the world, it is very resonant with this idea of, acting good so you will go to heaven, meaning you will ascend, rather than acting bad so you will go to hell, meaning descend on those levels. And similarly with bardo loops, if you act well today in this life, hopefully your next life for your Atman will be a more pleasurable, or maybe you will be able to ascend into a higher state of consciousness loop. And obviously the highest one is the Buddhahood, the enlightenment yet again. So, I'm not saying that this is how things are. I couldn't tell you how they are. They certainly seem true for me. And since you've not clicked pause just yet, I assume they don't sound completely out of whack for you too. And quite frankly, it does not matter. The point here is to consider and wonder upon deep and difficult, maybe impossible to answer ideas, but hopefully on a mission of enhancing one's life and inspiring one another. So this is the one part that I wanted to sort of highlight as well, that was really interesting for me in this particular book, but because there is quite a big emphasis placed on understanding this karmic experience. And it sounds like if we do believe that positive karma can compensate for and undo negative karma, then it is in line with those ideas that some therapists or spiritually focused people might share with you, that it pays to do well and it pays to undo some of the difficulties that you seem to be struggling with, because you're not only helping yourself, but you're also helping all of yous into the future and all of yous into the past, and potentially even all of your ancestors. This is a whole other kind of interesting ideas to unpack, maybe for another episode. But there is a book called Many Lives, Many Masters by Dr. Brian Weiss, which I don't know if I've created an episode for. I'll check that for you. But if I didn't, then just let me let me create that into the future. I took a note here of this. That's a great book that I must have missed. But there was this idea here that the lady was going through a therapy session. It was a hypnotherapy, and over the course of the hypnotherapy, which is all written in this book, she discovered and unpacked 37 past lives of her own. 37, I believe, was the right number, but, well, don't quote me on that. Anyway, and the idea was that because she's been unpacking those lives and living through those lives' traumas on a more conscious way, she was able to relieve that trauma and free herself and her ancestors of the troubles. And so this resonates very deeply with me in the context of karmic sort of baggage that we're carrying. So yeah, quite I appreciate that these are quite complex and maybe quite wacky ideas for you, but I hope they are quite useful. So in terms of the invitation and the challenge for this week, I thought about it for a while. I didn't know, I didn't want us to challenge ourselves too much, because I think a big part of humility in the course of this, especially transcending the level of consciousness, is to first and foremost start small, right? Similarly to starting maybe with 5 push-ups if you've never done push-ups before, rather than trying to make a whole 100 the first time. And so I've chosen to talk about guilt, because it seems to me that the world nowadays is struggling a lot with a lot of guilt as a form of maybe repression, and also self-criticism and shaming one another and oneself. So as a practice suggested by Hawkins, I'd like you to consider a situation, a thing, an experience that you might feel guilty or remorseful about. So maybe this is something that happened very far into the past. Maybe this is something that happened yesterday. It does not matter. It can be small or big. The point, really, the starting point is you feel within yourself that you feel guilty of it, and it nibbles on you. And you know how guilt feels. It feels awful. It's not a nice space to be in. And the invitation for you for this week and for your life, really, from Hawking and from Hawkins and from myself, is instead of criticizing yourself about this, instead of feeling guilty about this, recognize your limitations and let go of the ego's idea that you could have done better and that you are too good to make mistakes. And this is a very interesting, I would say, way of reframing a situation, right? So if I hurt someone and I feel guilty about it, I can go down 2 routes, right? I can make myself feel even worse over time by sort of self-criticizing myself and allowing my ego to tell me again and again how bad I was and how much of a mistake that was, because I allowed myself to fall so down this dark hole of bad activity. Or I could say in humility and courage, all right, I made a mistake, and to make mistakes is a human experience. It's normal. I am not perfect. I have troubles, and sometimes I do fall and stumble, and that's okay. Next time round, I will remember not to do that. Thank you so much, my guilt, my conscience, and my guilty conscience, in flagging this problem so we can avoid it next time. And just give it a try. It feels to me like the right way and a practical in it to approach troubles. And so I thought it's a good way of starting to have a bit more humility, a bit less self-criticism, and much more love for oneself and others. So yeah, I hope that once again this was an episode worth your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for reading the books that make you a better person. We're definitely better off because of it. And yeah, have a wonderful, wonderful week. Stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.